Great powers have begun using economic integration as weapons. Tariffs as leverage, financial infrastructure as coercion, supply chains as vulnerabilities to be exploited. You cannot live within the lie of mutual benefit through integration when integration becomes the source of your subordination.
Canada lives because of the United States. Remember that, Mark, the next time you make your statements.
Mark Carney was at the World Economic Forum yesterday and told them to stop living a lie about how the world really works, and then ironically exposes the far left's hypocrisy within minutes after being asked a pretty innocent question about his dealings with China. Today, Donald Trump called out Mark Carney directly, and he was not afraid to say the quiet part out loud. Let's take a look.
In 1978, the Czech dissident Václav Havel, later president, wrote an essay called The Power of the Powerless. And in it, he asked a simple question: how did the communist system sustain itself? And his answer began with a greengrocer. Every morning, this shopkeeper places a sign in his window: "Workers of the world unite." He doesn't believe it. No one does. But he places the sign anyway to avoid trouble, to signal compliance, to get along. And because every shopkeeper on every street does the same, the system persists. Not through violence alone, but through the participation of ordinary people in rituals they privately know to be false.
Now, this was interesting because Mark Carney is trying to say to the world at this point, we've all been participating in a system that we know isn't really working. There's risks to it, but we've just ignored those risks and gone along with it. But we know that it isn't really the right way to go. But here's the thing that I found very interesting about him invoking this. What does this remind you of? This reminds you of how the far left has taken over a lot of the cultural and social practices and norms and expectations in the West. And I guess it shouldn't be too surprising because this invocation is actually talking about what happened under, extreme socialists, which is extreme far left government and hegemony. So when you think about that, 80% of people, not just in Canada, but anyone that are in any of these Western countries that has been dominated by these radical far left social constructs, they've just gone along with it, and they've used pronouns and they've adhered to the expectations of them. They participate in DEI, but most people don't even believe it. They're too afraid to be called out, and they're too afraid to deal with the consequences, or they just don't want to be bothered in dealing with the consequences. They just want to live their lives. So the example is pretty interesting. And it's the same thing when you're dealing with climate change and the hypocrisy of all of the practices of it. And we're going to tax Canadians into oblivion, and that's going to save the world. So I found it very interesting that he opens with this, exposing the whole liberal ideology for the world to see on the World Economic Forum stage. And this also applies to virtually all of the policies at the World Economic Forum as well. Because most people know that they won't work, but it's a bunch of elites and world leaders and business people saying them. So they're just counting on the fact that people will say, well, I don't think it's right, but I'll just go along with it. It's very interesting how Mark Carney opened this.
Over the past 2 decades, a series of crises in finance, health, energy, and geopolitics have laid bare the risks of extreme global integration. But more recently, great powers have begun using economic integration as weapons. Tariffs as leverage, financial infrastructure as coercion, supply chains as vulnerabilities to be exploited. You cannot live within the lie of mutual benefit through integration when integration becomes the source of your subordination.
So what is Carney saying here? What he's trying to say is that, listen, us little countries, he calls them middle powers, us little countries, we have to realize that, you know, there's large superpowers, and he's basically talking about the United States. Duh. Large superpowers are now using economics as weapons, and we can't rely on them anymore, and we have to stop living this lie that I talked to you about earlier, that the system is working and that it's a system that we can trust. And he's trying to position this narrative that in the geopolitical landscape, using economics to enforce your foreign policy is new. And this is where he's also living the lie, or he doesn't understand how geopolitical policies and practices work. But I think it's the former. This is not new. This has been going on for thousands of years. A lot of times countries will resort to military, but they will not resort to military if they think that they can do it without losing a single troop. Because troops cost money. Not because the countries really back then cared about the lives of their troops. They cared about power, and they cared about money, and they cared about expense. So if you can force somebody to submit to you via economic means, that's going to be a lot cheaper and a lot better for your country long term than using military force. So this is not new. And countries don't deal with each other because they're friends. As much as we all like to think that. Countries deal with each other because they have shared ideology, they have shared values, and that there's some sort of mutual benefit from them. That's why Canada and the US have been such great trading partners over the last 100 years, because of the amount of trade that we do across the board. It's like $400 billion a year, something crazy like that. No other country benefits from that type of relationship. The US profits from it, and so does Canada. But Carney wants everybody to think, oh, well, we can't do with that anymore. This is something new that's happening, and we can't be engaging in this global integration of trade. Just keep that front and center.
Hegemons cannot continually monetize their relationships. Allies will diversify to hedge against uncertainty. They'll buy insurance, increase options in order to rebuild sovereignty. Sovereignty that was once grounded in rules but will increasingly be anchored in the ability to withstand pressure. This room knows this is classic risk management. Risk management comes at a price. But that cost of strategic autonomy, of sovereignty, can also be shared.
So, 2 minutes before, Mark Carney is telling everybody, globalism's over. Can't work anymore. Rules are thrown out the window. And then he starts to say, you know, it's these superpowers. They're the bad guys. They're going to continue to monetize, you know, their relationships. Well, hello, that's what they do. That's what they do. And that's what all of the little countries have been doing with them over the last 100 years. Because how do you explain what all these countries have been doing with China? They don't agree with the China methodology. They condemn China's treatment of the Uyghurs. They condemn China's political system because it's a communist regime, but have no problem looking the other way in order to make money off of China. So you've been monetizing your relationship as well. So let's call a spade here. You know, this isn't being pro-left, pro-right. This is being pro-truth. This is the reality. And to deny that reality, well, that's living the lie, as he talked about earlier. But he then goes on to say, well, you know, how do we do that? We need to rebuild sovereignty. What do you mean rebuild sovereignty? It's managing your own house is what it is. And for thousands of years, the base organizational principle for any society has been for war. To prevent or to win. So when countries start renting out their national security to these superpowers, what do you think's going to happen? And now you're acting all surprised when those superpowers are saying, well, what's the deal here? We're putting out all this money for world peace, and you guys are basically squatting in the house. And that's what Canada's been doing, and that's what all these other countries have been doing. Canada has been one of the worst offenders of it. And that's not to deride the people in our military. That's calling out the governments that have not funded them. That's a big difference. So then Carney goes on to say, well, we had to cooperate. Okay, so you were just saying that you know, global integration is not a good thing. Now you want global integration. So his new approach here is, well, we ignore the superpowers and all the middling countries come together and act like a superpower. Sounds like one big European Union. And how is the European Union working out? Doesn't sound like it's working out too well to me.
The big theme of your speech was the need for middle powers to work together. Yeah. But you've just been to the other great power, to China. And I think people are very intrigued by seeing that meeting. And some people say, kind of, that's a mistake, really, because you know, you're going to make yourself more dependent on China. They're not that benign either. The US will be very annoyed. What's the defense of what you're doing, and what do you hope to get out of it?
So recall that right before this, Mark Carney said, dealing with superpowers, you were essentially financing your own subordination. That's what he was saying, right? Don't deal with the superpowers, and you know you'll make yourself dependent on them, and that's a bad idea. So he literally just finished saying that, and this guy, surprisingly, is actually calling him out on this.
The first thing is to say it's not a defense. It's an. I know the way you frame the question, but it's offense. It's building out. It's something positive as opposed to against. We're for something as opposed to being against. The second is, there are very clear guardrails in that relationship. I spoke of calibration of relationships in my remarks. That's what I mean by it. But within those clear guardrails are huge opportunities in energy, both clean and conventional, obviously in motor vehicles, in agriculture, in financial services, all of which is mutually beneficial. So it's additive. And look, it's the second largest economy, and it's our second largest trading partner. We should have a strategic partnership with them. Within those guardrails, and that's what we've achieved.
The contradiction and the hypocrisy is astounding. It's not surprising. It's still astounding. Mark Carney, who's our first largest trading partner? By a country mile. Oh, right. That's the United States. Are they across the Pacific? Are they across the world? Oh, no. They're right next to us. So that just blows that out of the water. So that's number one. And number two, you end up having him talk about the fact that, oh, well, you know, well, they're number two. We should have a strategic partner with them. Well, yeah, we should have a strategic partnership with the United States, and we need to work through that. But he goes on to say, but it's okay. We have guardrails. You were just talking about forced subordination because superpowers can extort whatever they want from you. Everybody heard that. Please, Mr. Carney, explain to the class how Canada is going to enforce these quote-unquote guardrails with China. How are you going to prevent them from threatening our MPs? How are you going to prevent them from harassing our diaspora communities? How are you going to prevent them from all the extortion? How are you going to prevent them from rigging elections or trying to influence them in Canada? You have no capability to do that. Oh, well, you know, if you don't do that, then, well, we're just going to continue selling you what you want. He's calling out his own crap, and he's contradicting himself. And this is the problem. If you want to say that countries shouldn't deal with the superpowers anymore because they're becoming too reliant on them. Fine, you could actually argue that point. But you lose all credibility because the fact that you were just crowing that you signed this big strategic partnership with a superpower, one that is far less trustworthy than the one to the south. So you don't get to make that argument at all now, and you have no soapbox to stand on. And we postulated that Mark Carney's trip to China was at least partially motivated with the intent of ticking off Donald Trump. Now, to Donald Trump's credit, he didn't really take the bait. He said, sure, you should do a deal with China. Go ahead. And it seems like he was trying to tick off Donald Trump again in this speech because he didn't name the United States, but he was referring to the United States as essentially the bad guy in all of this. Now, again, we don't agree with tariffs being put on Canada. That's a bad thing. It's bad for our country. So, you know, we can walk and chew bubble gum at the same time. But at the same time, why aren't you scheduling lots of meetings with your closest ally, with your biggest trading partner, with the world's #1 economy? To ignore that seems like it would be bad economic advice. Just saying, Mr. Economist. So, it was interesting to hear Donald Trump come out and speak, and he spoke for over an hour, while Mark Carney's speech was about 30 minutes. And Donald Trump can be very challenging to listen to at some points because he does have prepared remarks by the sounds of it, but he will ad-lib a lot. And for me, at least, I have to really strip away a lot of the ad-lib to get to the core messaging of what he's saying. And there's a lot of things that he said that made a lot of sense.
Is that the more windmills a country has, the more money that country loses and the worse that country is doing. China makes almost all of the windmills. And yet I haven't been able to find any wind farms in China. Did you ever think of that? It's a good way of looking at it. They're smart. China's very smart. They make them, they sell them for a fortune. They sell them to the stupid people that buy them. But they don't use them themselves. They put up a couple of big wind farms, but they don't use them. They just put them up to show people what they could look like. They don't spin. They don't do anything. They use a thing called coal, mostly. But China goes with the coal. They go with oil and gas. They're starting to look at nuclear a little bit. And they're doing just fine. They make a fortune selling the windmills, though. And I think really that's one that they wouldn't be surprised if it stopped. They are shocked that it continues to go. They're very friendly with me. They're shocked that people continue to buy those damn things. They killed the birds. They ruin your landscapes. Other than that, I think they're fabulous, by the way. Stupid people buy them. The consequences of such destructive policies have been stark, including lower economic growth, lower standards of living, lower birth rates, more socially disruptive migration, more vulnerability to hostile foreign adversaries, and much, much smaller militaries.
So the beginning of that you could tell is ad lib, and then once he finished his improvisation, you could tell he dove right back into the prepared remarks. But what's interesting here is he's calling out these far left ideologies. That's what that was about. And he's saying that, listen, China's taking advantage of all this. And all of you folks out there that want to try and shame the superpowers and shame what they're doing, he's saying it out loud. He's saying you're all living the lie because you continue to do it, and you will continue to do it. This is almost the Ricky Gervais version at the World Economic Forum. That's basically what's going on here. And Donald Trump is saying, listen, all these policies, and it's not just climate. He was just using that as an example. But it's all of these policies. You're seeing birth rates in all the Western countries go down, and we've seen that. What's been the response from this? Again, the far left never deals with root cause. They deal with symptoms. So then they say, okay, well, we need more people. Therefore, immigration. What does that cause? That causes more social instability. In Canada, that has caused, to a large degree, the housing crisis to explode, our healthcare system to decrease rapidly, our education system to decrease. So you get all of these methodologies being implemented. And he's right. As much as you want to say bad things about the way Donald Trump communicates, and again, we don't think he's the greatest communicator, but you can't take away from the fact that what he just said there is right, as well as declining militaries. We talked about that earlier. And we talked about the fact that countries like Canada have been mooching off of the United States for a long, long time. If you don't believe it, check this out. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is defense expenditures. And you can see how far the United States is above everybody else. You add up everybody, doesn't come close to what the United States is spending. And this is from just a couple of years ago. So when Trump talks about the fact that people haven't been, or countries haven't been paying their fair share of NATO, he has a point. Much as you may not like Trump or disagree with him on a lot of things, he has a point.
Greenland is a vast, almost entirely uninhabited and undeveloped territory that's sitting undefended in a key strategic location between the United States, Russia, and China. That's exactly where it is, right smack in the middle. Wasn't important nearly when we gave it back. You know, when we gave it back, it wasn't the same as it is now. It's not important for any other reason, you know, everyone talks about the minerals. There's so many places. There's no rare earth, no such thing as rare earth. There's rare processing, but there's so much rare earth. And this, to get to this rare earth, you got to go through hundreds of feet of ice. That's not the reason we need it. We need it for strategic national security and international security. This enormous unsecured island is actually part of North America, on the northern frontier of the Western Hemisphere. That's our territory. It is therefore a core national security interest of the United States of America. And in fact, it's been our policy for hundreds of years to prevent outside threats from entering our hemisphere. And we've done it very successfully. We've never been stronger than we are now.
Okay, so there's a bunch in there. So what he's talking about in terms of, you know, we had Greenland, we gave it back. So in World War II, some of you may not know, the United States took the responsibility, and they were given that by Denmark. They took the responsibility to defend Greenland, and so they put up bases on there and things like that. And that was to benefit them. That was to benefit the Allies and all of that. And then after World War II was over, then the United States essentially handed back, you know, defensive control over Greenland back to Denmark. That's what he's talking about there. So, but he's trying to frame this as, oh, well, you know, Denmark gave us Greenland and then we gave it back. Okay, well, you know, this is where semantics come into play, and you can argue whatever you want. The point is that he's trying to say that Greenland is a piece of real estate that's of strategic importance to the United States. And you could argue for that. You know, some people may argue against it. It's beside the point. What is relevant is that, does the United States have the legal right to take it? And the answer is no. So one of the things that we talked about the other day on X was the fact that Donald Trump was asked by a reporter, are you willing to, you know, rule out force to take it? And Donald Trump wouldn't answer that. So the problem is when you don't answer that type of question, it sends an implication. And this is one of the issues that, you know, I have with Donald Trump's communication is he likes to play with the media in that way. He likes to play this cat and mouse game. And the problem is as the President of the United States, what you say and don't say, it really carries a lot of weight. as much as people may try and say, oh, that's not the case, he didn't say this, he didn't say that, or he did say this, or he did say that, let's just cut the BS. When you're asked a question like that and you don't refute it, that's a problem, because it sends a message out there. Now, evidently, his advisors had told him, sir, you need to deal with that, because that's becoming the narrative out there. So, to Donald Trump's credit, he cleared that up quite clearly at the World Economic Forum.
And we never got anything. We probably won't get anything unless I decide to use excessive strength and force, where we would be, frankly, unstoppable. But I won't do that. Okay? Now everyone's saying, oh, good. That's probably the biggest statement I made, because people thought I would use force. I don't have to use force. I don't want to use force. I won't use force. All the United States is asking for is a place called Greenland, where we already had it as a trustee, but respectfully returned it back to Denmark not long ago, after we defeated the Germans, the Japanese, the Italians, and others in World War II. We gave it back to them. We were a powerful force then, but we are a much more powerful force now.
Now, contrary to popular belief, the Americans didn't single-handedly win World War II, and I think everybody knows that. Donald Trump would like you to believe that they did, but they did not. Were they a major factor in helping turn the tide? Sure, 100%. You would be foolish to say otherwise. But the world was a vastly different place back then. And for him to say not long ago, well, I'm not sure what not long ago means to Donald Trump, but he used to say, in the same speech, he said forever meant 45 years ago, but 80 years ago is when World War II ended, so apparently that's not long ago. Again, this is what happens when you get tripped up in all of these inaccuracies that don't really mean a lot in the grand scheme of things when you're looking at Donald Trump speaking. You have to strip all of that away to actually get at his core message. And his core message was this on Greenland: we're not going to use force. So he unequivocally said that. So we will acknowledge that. And I think it was a very good idea for him to say that. And because he's acknowledged that, everything else is fair game. He can negotiate. He can do whatever he wants. And that's all within the bounds of a fair game and world sovereignty. Go to town. I now don't care about Donald Trump's play on Greenland, because it sounds like they're going to try to negotiate. If he wants to buy it, I don't care what he wants to do, but he's going to try to acquire it through a means of non-force. And later on in the questions, he's actually asked about this, and he says, well, what if you can't come to a deal? And then he said, well, that would be unfortunate, but we'll remember that. That's what he says. So the whole Greenland thing, I think, is now put to bed. And you could tell that he was told, sir, you have to address this, because that kind of came out in what he was saying. Anyway, he wasn't done.
Canada gets a lot of freebies from us, by the way. They should be grateful also, but they're not. I watched your prime minister yesterday. He wasn't so grateful. But they should be grateful to us. Canada lives because of the United States. Remember that, Mark, the next time you make your statements. What we did for Israel was amazing, but that's nothing compared to what we have planned for the United States, Canada, and the rest of the world. We are going to build a dome like no other. We did it for Israel. And by the way, I told Bibi, stop taking credit for the dome. That's our technology. That's our stuff. But they had a lot of courage, and they were good fighters, and they did a good job, and we wiped out the Iran nuclear threat like nobody can believe. Nobody's ever seen anything like it. That, Venezuela, taking down Soleimani, wiping out al-Baghdadi when he tried to reinstitute ISIS. We did a lot.
So whether you want to say that's bragging, or whether you want to say that is just Trump wanting to state all the US's accomplishments and what they've done. Doesn't really matter. What does matter is the fact that what he's talking about is the fact that the United States does a lot to preserve world peace. That is undeniable. And when you have these spineless little leaders like Mark Carney and all these other folks that subscribe to these far left policies, start saying, oh, well, maybe, we've been squatting in this house for a long time. Maybe it's time to move houses because the landlord isn't going to let us mooch off of them anymore. Well, that's what Mark Carney was saying yesterday. If you strip everything down, that's what he was saying. And now that the superpower that was protecting everybody is saying, well, hold on. We can't do this alone. Why aren't you paying what everybody agreed to pay? And then they want to throw up their hands and call victim and all of this stuff. And it's frankly BS. And I get it. So who's the one that has not been acting in good faith, Mr. Carney? Is it the United States that has been footing the vast majority of the bill and being the world police force, effectively? Or is it the folks that have been taking advantage of that? And countries that have said, we can downsize our military. We don't need them anymore. We'll invest in social programs. Ironically, investing in the military and celebrating that, I would argue, was one of the most important social programs. Helped maintain a sense of pride in your country. Helped maintain a sense of order. Help people understand that national security is a serious thing. And being called to fight for your country is a serious thing. And it's an honorable thing. Instead of regarding the military as a joke. Because when you maintain the military as a core function of your country, that permeates through the rest of society. And it has all of these impacts on your social status, on the conversations that you have, and even how people interact with each other. It's amazing how much of an effect it has. And this is where Donald Trump blatantly calls out Mark Carney. He calls him out and he says, listen, I heard what you said. Sounds like you're completely ungrateful for all that we've been doing. And it's nuts. It's absolutely nuts. But again, I think he was hoping to provoke a much stronger reaction from Donald Trump. Kudos to Trump, didn't fall for it. Carney didn't get his headline. What you see in the headlines today is, Trump says that Canada wouldn't survive without the United States. Well, from a military perspective, please argue the counter to that. I'd love to hear it. And creating some sort of epic fantasy like Lord of the Rings as your argument isn't going to cut it because it's false. Without the United States, the world's most powerful country right next to us, if China or Russia wanted to come in, nobody could stop them in Canada. Sorry. It's just how it is. So it's an interesting rebuttal that Trump is doing here to a lot of the policies that have come out of the economic forum. He called them all out in his talk there. And he rebutted Mark Carney at the same time. Quite respectfully, might I add.
We also know that on the AI, there is fierce competition between the US as the largest economy in the world, 27% of the global GDP and 5% of the global population, not doing that badly, and China. And we know that competition is very tough on AI. I know you're heading to a state visit to China in April. How do you see the US-China relationship moving forward? Are you able to combine this tough competition with also collaboration?
So I've always had a very good relationship with President Xi and with President Putin. Talk about, the larger powers. But I've always had a very good relationship with President Xi of China. He's an incredible man. What he's done is amazing. He's highly respected by everybody. And I do now.
So what Trump's saying is China's no joke. And he has a productive relationship with China. He has a productive relationship with Putin. Because if all you're doing is saber rattling, you're not going to get a lot done. And he also talks about the fact that a lot of people respect President Xi Jinping. Like it or not, China has turned itself from a third world country into, let's just say, a more advanced country. The only price was their freedom. But people respect Xi Jinping because they have to. And this is the order of the world. This is the way the world works. Mark Carney would have you believe, well, we just have to stop doing that and then it'll stop happening. Well, no, that's not how it's going to work. And Mark Carney says, well, you know, I know how the world works. Do you? Because you're essentially advocating that everybody should just start ignoring the superpowers and see what happens. We'll become our own superpower. Well, here's the problem with the European Union. You have a bunch of squabbling leaders. And the economy in the European Union isn't doing well. And the way the West has been operating isn't doing well. So there needs to be something set for nationalist pride, people celebrating the fact that they are belonging to a country, belonging to a nationality, celebrating the culture that is there. And that becomes resistant to immigration and all of the problems that comes with it. Not resistant to immigrants. Immigrants are fine. But the problems that far left ideologies bring with their immigration systems. This melting pot, this people should just shut up and allow new cultures to come in and their laws to come into the country. No, there's something to be said for nationalism, but that doesn't exclude collaboration with other countries on the world stage. And this is how NATO was born. This is how all of these Western alliances were born. That was the heyday. Because you had all these countries that had the same values and that had the same objectives. They wanted prosperity, they wanted peace, but they still celebrated their own individual identities. And over time, that has eroded. And Mark Carney would have you believe, and the World Economic Forum would have you believe, that that's the way that the world should continue operating. No. The way it should continue operating, in my opinion, is you know who your friends are. You may fight with them. You may call each other idiots. But in the end, this is what the part is missing. This is that last mile that we're waiting for the US. Is for those two friends to go to a bar, sit down, hug it out, and have a beer. Because when you know who your true friends are, your true friends, those are people you don't turn your back on. Despite the fact they're being an idiot. It's your job to tell them they're being an idiot. That's what real friends are for. And in the long run, they'll appreciate you for doing that. So that doesn't mean that we can't have other trade relationships with other countries. That's fine. But for you to say we need to not be subordinated by superpowers, only to then turn around and walk into China, one of the most dangerous superpowers on the planet, and try to say, well, we're going to have a strategic partnership, but don't worry, we've put in guardrails. Carney, you can't even control your own borders. How are you going to control China? And this is what Trump has said. Listen, the point is that the United States is one of the most powerful countries on the planet, and you may not like dealing with Trump, but you have to deal with the US. And it's time that these folks in Ottawa get their heads screwed on straight and get on down to the US. And it's time to talk to your friend, hug it out, and go have that beer so we can get back to what matters, which is mutual prosperity and creating the strongest economy on the face of the planet.